Hello, I'm talking with Eileen Claussen. She's president of the Pew Center on Global Climate Change and Strategies for the Global Environment. Eileen, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
You were speaking at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. There was a forum today on talking about possibilities at Copenhagen. Did you hear any consensus there?
Well, it was a very interesting panel. We had Margot Wallström from the European Commission, and I was there, and Mohammed El Ashri, who is now with the UN Foundation. And all of us have long histories on this issue, and there were some points of agreement, but there also were points where we have a very different perspective. So I think it was interesting.
Okay. What the places where you had agreement, where did you come together from your different perspectives?
I think we all agreed that the ultimate goal of this international negotiation is a binding international treaty with absolute reduction targets for developed countries and finance provided by developed countries and measurable, reportable, and verifiable commitments from developing countries. So the end goal, I think, common agreement. What you can actually get out of Copenhagen, some agreement and some disagreement.
Well, what's your view on what we can get?
Well, I mean, I think the goal is absolutely not achievable. There are three big issues that we've seen coming down the road there in these negotiations starting 2 years ago, and none of them are resolved. They are what the developed countries will agree to do, what the developing countries will agree to do, and what the financial arrangements and amounts will be. And then in the last meeting, which just ended last week in Bangkok, there was another big issue that was sort of added to this. So instead of taking away issues because you've agreed on them, we actually added an issue, and that is, what is the form, the legal form of this agreement? Is it Kyoto? Is it a totally new agreement, or is it some combination of the two? And there was widespread disagreement about that. So 5 more negotiating days before Copenhagen, huge issues. I think we need to move to Plan B.
Okay. Well, what is Plan B then?
Well, the most ambitious Plan B would be a framework with the numbers and the details to be filled in later. But that would require the developing countries, who have been reluctant so far to actually say binding commitments for us, different than the developed countries, but nevertheless internationally binding. They'd have to give on that to get a framework in place. And it seems to me that without finance and without knowing what the US in particular will do, that's pretty unlikely. So if you go down from there, maybe it's a strong political declaration and then a date certain to complete the negotiations.
So a Copenhagen roadmap.
Yes, a Copenhagen roadmap.
Well, now let me come back to the U.S. because the Pew Center is part of the Climate Action Partnership, and your blueprint was the basis for the Waxman-Markey legislation that went through the House. And let me ask you, do you know, is that blueprint also being used in the Senate?
Yes, I mean, I think the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, 25 major companies and 5 non-government organizations, put together this blueprint, and yes, it was influential in the House, and I think it's influential in the Senate. But because the debate has moved on, we're actually now wrestling with what kinds of changes we might want to make, or how we might want to continue to be relevant to what emerges in the Senate.
Well, what do you see? Do you see any chance, or what are the chances for a Senate vote on this by the time of Copenhagen?
I think they're abysmally small. I think healthcare is going to take probably till the end of the year. I think a bill will come out of Environment and Public Works probably in November. But because I don't think that committee is representative of the Senate as a whole, it seems to me that we're still going to have to do a lot of work to actually get a bill that can get 60 votes. And the optimist in me says we might be able to do it in the first quarter of 2010.
Well, now, how necessary do you think a Senate vote is for the president going into Copenhagen? President Obama has certainly made a lot of changes in policies and so on since he took office. Is what he's done and the House vote enough to convince the other negotiators in Copenhagen that yes, the U.S. is making changes, is going to commit?
Well, I think there is a perception that we certainly are making changes. EPA is certainly moving ahead under this administration, and the House action was a big deal. But I also think the administration will not be able to agree to a specific number until it knows what the Senate will do. And I don't think the committee vote is enough to really know what the end game is in the Senate. So I don't think the U.S. could actually commit in Copenhagen to a specific number. If the U.S. doesn't commit to a number, the developing countries are unlikely to commit. If there isn't money on the table, they're even more unlikely to commit, which is why I think Copenhagen can be an important step along the way, but it's not the end.
Okay. Well, you raised the issue of the Kyoto Protocol that came up in the last week, particularly in Bangkok. Is that really the impasse it appears to be? Can that be overcome? I mean, the U.S. has proposed an alternate protocol for some time.
Right. I mean, the U.S. wants a totally new agreement. The European Union has now said a new agreement is fine, but it should have Kyoto inside it, integrated into it. And the developing countries right now are saying, everyone is abandoning Kyoto. We really like Kyoto. Well, why do they like Kyoto? Because the developed countries have real binding commitments, but they don't. So is there a middle ground here or something that can be worked out? I think it's going to be very, very difficult.
Okay. Financing, another very, very difficult issue. There have been a number of mechanisms proposed in international negotiations. Have you seen any one that you think is starting to get any kind of traction?
I mean, I think the Mexican proposal, which has changed a little bit over time, is probably the basis for an agreement. But the fact is, there hasn't been any coalescence around that. There actually hasn't been real movement on finance in these talks at all, on the mechanism, let alone the amount of money that countries are able to pledge. And of course, the president can't pledge a number here because that's really up to the Congress to decide on things like that. So he isn't going to be able to have a number either for financing or for a target for the U.S.
Two very important numbers, yeah. Well, Eileen Claussen, president of the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.